I am a member of Marx21 from the land of the now seemingly perpetual sunset, occupied indigenous territory of the Cowlitz and Clackamas tribes, along with many others who lived and traded here, or as you probably know it better, Portland, Oregon. And this is a distressingly timely moment to have a discussion on the climate crisis, with so much of the United States West Coast currently burning, and the resulting smoke casting an apocalyptic reddish hue over everywhere that isn't burning. California is seeing the largest fire ever in the state's history. August was its hottest on record. Here in Oregon, almost 1 in 10 residents have been forced to evacuate from their homes as of a couple days ago. Portland's air quality this week was worse than any other major city in the world. Smoky haze here is so heavy that going outside without at least a KN95 mask is a recipe for headaches, nausea, and worse. Not to mention the hazards of breathing in lung irritants during a still raging pandemic. So everything the climate scientists warned us about is coming true. Meanwhile, Democratic Party candidate for president has not only refused to come out against environmentally catastrophic practices such as fracking for oil and methane, itself a greenhouse gas, but has promised to increase the budget of the U.S. military, the largest global terrorist organization, and the largest single polluter in the world. This is what is considered the lesser evil. To help us answer that burning question of how we can achieve a truly green recovery and whether the present capitalist system will even allow it, we have here an amazing speaker who has been influential in framing our understanding of both the current environmental crisis of capitalism, and the importance of radical socialist responses. Martin Empson is a socialist climate campaigner and co-author and editor of System Change, Not Climate Change, also the author of Land and Labor, Marxism, Ecology, and Human History, and a member of the British Socialist Workers' Party, one of Marx21's elder sibling organizations in the International Socialist Tendency. As for Marx21 itself, we are a revolutionary socialist organization with members across the United States. We stand in the tradition of socialism from below, the idea that workers should democratically control all the means of our survival, and that we can only bring about such emancipation as workers ourselves through our own collective struggles. You can sign up to stay in touch with us in a link that will be posted in the comments shortly here. And with that, I will kick it off to Martin.
Thanks, Noel, and thanks to Marx21 for asking me to speak. It's always great to talk to comrades and activists are shocked and terrified by what we're seeing on the TV screens, on the social media, and so on. The scale of the fires is, as Noel said, absolutely unprecedented, and it's an indication of quite how bad the climate crisis is getting for millions of people. And I want to talk today about several different aspects of the climate crisis. In particular, I want to talk about the way that I think both the COVID-19 epidemic and the climate crisis demonstrate the utter failure of capitalism as a system of social relationship with the wider natural world. I also am going to develop to show that the responses to both climate change and COVID-19 are a failure of neoliberalism, the neoliberal contemporary approach to economics. And I'm not going to talk in detail then about climate science or the exact nature of what's taking place at the moment. There are plenty of articles and books that look at that. I want to sort of break open what it is about capitalism that generates environmental crisis on an unprecedented scale, environmental crisis that's getting worse by the day, but also allows pandemics like COVID-19 to take place, and to explore some of what that means in contemporary society. I also want to point out, though, that while the world is fixated on COVID-19 and to a lesser extent the fires on the west coast of the states, it's tending to ignore environmental crisis elsewhere in the world. You have to actually search, if you want, to find out that in the Sahel area of Africa, currently there are some of the greatest floods that have ever been seen there. In Senegal, last week there were 3 months worth of rain in just seven hours, and cities like Dakar are really suffering. In Niger, again, massive floods that have inundated and destroyed huge areas of agricultural land, up to 5,000 hectares of rice crops, for instance, being destroyed. Dozens of people have died in those floods. Tens of thousands of people have been made homeless. Hundreds of thousands of people have been affected and will continue to be affected. And yet the voices of people in the global south are forgotten or ignored, or relegated to small articles on the back pages of websites when it's a rich, predominantly white nation that is suffering, like in the US. It's not to diminish the suffering of anyone around the world, but to highlight the way that climate change and also COVID-19 are experienced through the fractures and fault lines of capitalist societies, of race, of class, of gender, and so on. And as I said, I'm not going to talk in great detail about the climate crisis, the environmental crises that are taking place around the world. It's not just, of course, global warming. There's the enormous biodiversity crisis and so on. I do want to really, though, to try and talk a little bit about what's happening around the climate in the context of COVID-19, because 2020 has been bad for all sorts of reasons, predominantly the pandemic, but that hasn't, even though that's been on the front pages, it hasn't really taken away from what is happening to the environment elsewhere. And there's been some really shocking news when it comes to environmental destruction over the last sort of 6 months, news that's very rarely been part of the general political and media discourse. For instance, in Greenland, we've seen some of the news of some of the fastest ever rates of melting of the Greenland ice cap, water that will lead directly to sea level rises over the coming years, and the impacts that will mean. We've seen in the Bay of Bengal the largest ever super-cyclone, Cyclone Amphan, which led to 2 million people, an absolutely unbelievable number of people, 2 million people in Bangladesh and parts of India being evacuated away from the storm. We've seen Hurricane Laura in the US, and this currently is the peak of the hurricane season. So while COVID-19 has had the headlines, the impact of the emissions, the global emissions that we've already done, is still continuing to drive climate change on a frightening and unprecedented scale. And really, as I said, this is representative of a wider crisis of capitalism, a crisis of an economic system that sees the natural world, as I'll explore in a bit, as being part and parcel of the productive process, part of how big business, how corporations, how firms make profits. And really, I'm going to argue that existing political leaders, existing politicians have almost no answers to this crisis. And really, to explore some of that, I want to develop a couple of concepts. The first of which is the question of the Anthropocene, which is a technical term, a scientific term that has been part of scientific discourse for a number of years and is increasingly being used on the left. Its strict meaning is to say that we're now living in an era where the action of humanity, or actions of people, define what is happening on to the environment and to the world. That if future generations are able to look back upon the geological record, they will see for the first time in the Earth's history that the changes that we're making to the planet are leaving permanent records in the soil and so on. And that term has been used and abused in many ways. The scientists who came up with it tended to see it not as an expression of all of humanity's guilt within the environmental crisis, but actually to see it as representative of the world that we're living, the economic and political system that we have, the capitalist system, and how that concentrates wealth in the hands of a tiny minority of capitalists and power in the hands of a smaller group of the population, and then that's social relations that are driving and leading to the environmental destruction that we are seeing, and indeed one that seems to be accelerating on a daily basis. I think the fires in the West Coast and California and Oregon and so on, it feels to me like we've entered a new stage of the climate and environmental crisis. But what's interesting is that at the beginning of the lockdowns, at the beginning of the pandemic in March and so on this year, as it became clear that sections of industry would be shut down, that millions of people in the developed world particularly would be working from home and so on, there was actually quite a lot of hope that the pandemic would have a different consequence for the environment. There was a real expectation that this would lead to a significant reduction in the emissions that are driving climate change and an improvement of the environment generally. And that's happened on a smaller scale. As the chairperson suggested, I'm in the UK. I live in a town in the northwest and in a post-industrial city in Manchester of about 1 million or so people in the larger area. And in the immediate aftermath of lockdown, the immediate aftermath of the sort of large amount of commuter traffic declining, there was a fast decline in nitrogen oxide in the atmosphere, a pollutant that comes particularly from car exhausts, burning of petrol and diesel, and so on. And that's an interesting fact in of itself, that within a few weeks of car usage dropping, there was a 70% decline in this pollutant. And it's important because the city where I live sees up to 1,200 people die a year from respiratory illnesses, predominantly driven, they're not only driven by the pollutants from the burning of fossil fuels. In fact, there are something like 150 roads in Manchester where pollution is above legal limits. So when the lockdown happens and the air improved and the visibility improved and the traffic declined, there's a real sense, I think, for lots and lots of ordinary people that things might be bad with the pandemic, but there were indications and potentials for things to be better. At least one study suggested that across Europe, something like 11,000 people were alive who might have died from respiratory illness if pollution had been at the levels it was before the lockdowns and the pandemic started. And there were some real generalizations from this. I think ordinary people experienced it very differently to how some of the pundits talked about it. Anecdotally, lots of my friends commented that they could hear birdsong for the first time because there was no traffic, that it was nice to go and walk in the parks and around your house because the air was cleaner and so on. But really, some of the media commentators had much bigger expectations. The Guardian, the biggest left newspaper in the UK, predicted dramatic decline in carbon dioxide emissions that they thought would lead to significant reduction in the impact of climate change, holding back almost the damage that had been previously done. So around April of this year, the Guardian was predicting that would be something like a 17% decrease in emissions. But by June and the summer of this year, actually all of that had gone out the window. All the sort of liberal hopes that the benefit of the lockdown would be an improvement to the general environment were dissipated. And there was a very important study in the journal Nature and Climate Change, which predicted that the real decrease in global warming as a result of the lockdowns would be actually much closer to 0.01% Celsius. And the scientists who wrote that article made a very interesting conclusion, and I'll read it for the benefit of those of you who don't read Nature Climate Change whenever it appears. These results highlight, the scientists said, that without underlying long-term system-wide decarbonisation of economies, even massive shifts in behaviour only lead to modest reductions in the rate of warming. However, economic investment choices for the recovery will strongly affect the warming trajectory by mid-century. Pursuing a green stimulus recovery out of the post-COVID-19 economic crisis can set the world on track for keeping the long-term temperature goal of the Paris Agreement within sight. Now, I think that's a fascinating insight from the authors of that paper, a group of scientists who are, from the data, drawing very explicit political conclusions about the need to come out of the pandemic, come out of the economic crisis that we're seeing, with solutions that shift economies towards a green, sustainable, future. And I think they reflect they're part of a growing consensus that the world cannot go back to the pre-pandemic situation, that there needs to be a different outcome, if you like, that we need to use the situation as an opportunity to reconstruct our economies along a sustainable way, a green recovery, a Green New Deal, a Build Back Better is the slogan that I noticed even Joe Biden, that the chair referred to, is using. And there's a problem with this vision. Part of it is posed by the question the chair rightly said at the start, which is, will capitalism allow us to have that sort of recovery? But also the problem is it assumes that somehow the climate crisis is a superficial aspect of the capitalist economy, and that it can be simply repaired by the redirecting of resources along the lines of the political and economic system that we've already got. And there is a danger that, in the hope that things will be returned to normal or a more normal-like situation, we neglect the reality of the environmental crisis, which is the absolute misery for millions of people globally and increasingly large numbers of people. Naomi Klein puts it very, very well in response to a suggestion that we could go back to normal. She said in an interview earlier in 2020, normal was crisis. Normal was Australia on fire. Normal was the Amazon on fire. Normal is the third mass bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef. Normal is a crisis. Normal doesn't allow you to have a safe future. And I think it's that sort of politics and that sort of sense of things are fundamentally wrong, which has fueled some of the massive climate and environmental protests we've seen over the recent years. 2020, if it hadn't been for the pandemic, certainly in Britain, would have been a year of climate protests. We were due to have the UN climate talks here at the end of the year. There were major mobilizations planned by the climate strikers, by Extinction Rebellion, by the trade union movement, by the NGOs, and so on, to demand real solutions at the UN conference. Obviously, that's been on hold, but this sense that normal is crisis, that normal is disaster, I think has fueled that radical element within the environmental movement that wants system change, not climate change. And the politicians, of course, have seized on this. Boris Johnson, the right-wing prime minister here in the UK, he told us back in May that we owe it to future generations to build back better, he said. As I mentioned, Biden and other politicians are using the slogans of build back better or a green recovery for their own plans. There is a hope, I think, and a belief amongst lots of environmental organisations and environmental activists that we can use the opportunity in the direction of a green recovery, and I'll come back to that in a bit. But I want to look at what's actually happening outside of the politicians' rhetoric, because when people like Boris Johnson say we owe it to future generations to build back better, you kind of expect at least they're going to make some sort of attempts to deal with the environmental crisis in the way that we hope. But actually the opposite is happening, and this is what's quite frightening, I think, from an environmental point of view, that the actual response to COVID-19 and the climate crisis has been to reward and pour resources into the hands of those corporations that have caused the problem in the first place. Now, this might be expected in the United States, where Trump has very explicitly, and I'll give you some of the figures in a moment, very explicitly Trump has used the crisis to channel and funnel money towards fossil fuel corporations to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. And that might be expected from a politician like Trump, but around the world, there's been a similar response from the European Union, from the British government, China, India, and so on. What's actually happened is that the bailouts for COVID-19 have become bailouts for fossil fuel capitalism, bailouts for big oil, gas, coal companies, bailouts for car companies, airlines, and so on. The corporations who make their profits from destroying the planet and driving climate crisis. And some of the figures are quite staggering. Comrades in the US may be more au fait with some of these than I was before we researched this. But in the United States, for instance, something like $50 million of the money set aside for small businesses to protect them in the pandemic has gone directly to oil, gas, and coal coal companies. The something like $3 billion in COVID aid that Trump promised has gone to 5,000 fossil fuel companies, many of them small organizations, but also some of the really, really big corporations have had plenty of cash as well. The $2 trillion bailout that Trump has offered, 61 billion of that has gone directly, or initially went directly to airlines and so on, and this has been true across the world. Europe, something like $34 billion euros has gone to European airline companies over the period. In China, bailouts are slightly different, but they have restarted and given the green light to building programs for coal-fired power stations and so on to kickstart their economic recovery, reversing a trend that stopped about 5 years ago for the building of coal plants and so on. In Canada, bailout cash has gone to the tar sands companies. In South Korea, to coal companies. And as I said, in Europe to fossil fuel corporations, to the tune of billions of Europe. And there's dozens of other examples. And even in the UK, they've claimed that they're going to put £3 billion into energy efficiency and so on. But actually, vastly more amounts have gone to airlines, car companies, and so on. And so, really, I suppose for the last bit of this talk, I'm going to try and unpick why that is. And I think partly there's a tendency in the environmental movement to simply say it's because the world is organized for profit, not for people, for profit, not for planet, that the money gets put into the hands of these corporations. And of course, that is partly true. Capitalism is a system that is driven by the accumulation of wealth for the sake of accumulation. It's driven by the need of the corporations to make more profits, which they can reinvest, that they can use to expand their business. Marx called capitalism the system of accumulation. Moses and the prophets, he said, that's what drives the system. But actually, I think that system of accumulation of capitalism is a much more complex system from the point of view of the environment. And what has happened is I'm going to try and answer in two ways. The first of which is to say that capitalism is a system that is driven by profit, but it is also a system, like all human societies throughout history, that rests upon a relationship with the natural world. Marx makes the point somewhere that before humans can create societies, compose music, build cathedrals, or whatever humans do, they have to satisfy the basic needs of survival: food, shelter, clean water, and so on. And to satisfy those needs, you have to have a relationship with nature. Humans have to labor upon the natural world to change it in their own interests. Marx writes that this is a process of mediation between man and nature, and that develops under capitalism. And under capitalism, the global reach of society, the fact that capitalism is a system that drives, that makes production based on the drive for profit, means that the relationship to nature is a completely different one to all previously existing societies. Marx puts it really beautifully. He writes that under capitalism,
20 minutes, by
for the first time, nature becomes purely an object for humankind, purely a matter of utility. It ceases to be recognized as a power for itself, and the theoretical discovery of its autonomous laws are merely a ruse to subjugate it under human need, whether as an object of consumption or as a means of production. Under capitalism, as Marx says, the society only sees nature as an object for making profit. It has a completely different relationship to the natural world, and the development of capitalism saw the transformation of human relations, the forcible transformation of human relations with the natural world in the interests of that profit, of introducing that profit-making system, the dispossession of people from their land, the destruction of old ways of organizing society, the systematic breaking up and shattering of indigenous communities' relationship to nature, and so on. A very violent process, both where capitalism first developed in Western Europe, and then as it spread around the world through a process of colonial exploitation. And the second aspect to it, which I'll touch on briefly, and maybe we'll come back to in the discussion, is that capitalism is a fossil fuel system. At a particular point in history, the Marxist Andreas Malm has written a wonderful series of articles and books about how this process takes place. Capitalism adopts fossil fuels as its main method of generating energy. And once that takes place, capitalism globally becomes enmeshed into a relationship with nature that depends on the burning of fossil fuels, initially coal, then gas and oil, and so on. And dealing with that environment requires more than simply tinkering around the edges. So the Green New Deals, the green recovery plans are limited because they don't end up challenging that dominance of fossil fuels within the system. As somebody said earlier, as the chair said earlier, Joe Biden won't condemn the fracking companies. Why? Because to do so means condemning the most massive corporations at the heart of the system. The bailouts that we've seen around COVID-19 are aimed at major fossil fuel corporations because they are the biggest corporations in the economies. Without them, the capitalist system is threatened and is under threat. And Naomi Klein, about a year ago, wrote a wonderful book called On Fire, where she explored the politics of the Green New Deal. And she makes the point that there are various Green New Deals depending on which politicians you're talking to and what part of the political spectrum they come from. But actually, the Green New Deal can only be a success if it does challenge both the fossil fuel corporations and if it starts to challenge the inequalities, the legacies of colonialism and imperialism, the racism, homophobia and sexism that's at the heart of the capitalist system. The Green New Deal has to offer something to masses of ordinary people if it's to be a way of truly introducing a challenge to the unsustainable capitalist society we live in. And that's why Naomi Klein and revolutionaries like myself and activists put our hope not in electing politicians who promise that they might introduce some sort of green recovery plan. Actually, for us, the challenge to the environmental destruction that is taking place has to come from mass movements from below. And there's two reasons for this. Firstly, and I'll conclude on these points. Firstly, the movements themselves are the only ones that have the power to challenge the multinational corporations at the heart of capitalism. It's going to be the mass mobilizations of protesters. It's going to be the big mobilizations of working people that will be able to stop and then roll back the actions of the polluters, like the coal, oil, and gas companies, the airlines, and so on. But the second reason for it is that if we're to have a vision of a society that is sustainable, it has to be one that has a different relationship with the natural world. And as I suggested, capitalism arose at a particular point of history and transformed our relationship to nature, turned nature into a commodity, as that quote from Marx says. We need to undo that. And that doesn't mean suggesting we're going to go back to some sort of pre-capitalist feudal relationship with nature. No, it means that actually we're going to develop and go on forward, transforming our relationship to nature, using the understanding and technological know-how that we have in a way that benefits ordinary people, the majority of society. And I always think that the one thing that the left and the Marxist movement and tradition can offer the environmental movement is a vision of how that sustainable society would function. Because for us, the real revolutionary tradition is one that sees working class power at the heart of a new way of organizing society. Marx learned from the Paris Commune when workers took over the capital of France. We in our tradition have learned from Lenin and Trotsky in the revolutionary overthrow of the Tsarist regime in Russia in 1917, because both those examples showed that when revolutions happen, working class people, men and women, start to own and organize and plan the world that they live in. And it's this vision, I think, of a democratically controlled, planned economy, which we can offer as an alternative to the irrational plans of production under capitalism, a vision of a society where ordinary men and women make decisions about what is made and why it's made in the interests of both themselves and in the interests of our relationship with the natural world. And really, I think you see in the new movements that are arising, the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, showing around the world, the Extinction Rebellion, the climate strikes, the beginnings of social movements that can go on to challenge capitalism, to bring back a real alternate way of organizing the world in the interests of people and planet. So I'll leave my comments there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that there, Martin. And now we'll be moving on to question and answer stage of the meeting. If you have any questions or topics, in the subject that you'd like Martin to address here, go ahead and type those into the YouTube or Facebook chat. And looks like we've already got a few of them there. And okay, so our first question is from Feline. Wondering what you would say, Martin, to people who argue that we've already done too much damage, that there is no way to save the planet and ourselves anymore.
It's a cheerful question to start off. Well, firstly, I don't think we have yet, though I think probably we are at a point in history very close to where we will see fundamental breakdowns in the ecological systems that life depends upon. It's not impossible. I mentioned the melting of the Greenland ice cap. It's not impossible to imagine a situation in 100 years' time or so where that has taken place and has fundamentally shifted ocean currents in a way that transformed the ambient temperatures in Western Europe and so on. And certainly the world has, for millions of people, particularly in coastal regions of countries like Bangladesh and India and so on, already begun to change very, very fundamentally. I think that the question for socialists has to be different, though, which is that we have to start by saying, what can we do in the here and now to make sure things don't go down that route? Because while there's still people fighting back, while there's still resistance, there is hope that things can be better, and that we can make very real differences very, very quickly. It's quite easy to imagine winning concessions from the capitalists that could quite quickly transform how our relationship with nature is. As I suggested in the discussion about COVID-19, one of the things that became apparent quite quickly is that even small changes in people behavior can actually have big effects in terms of air pollution and so on. So let's imagine a scenario where the city I live, we very quickly get rid of private transport, but we have free public transport, cycling, walking and so on is encouraged. There's huge amounts of funding for organisations to develop those public transport and so on, where public transport is state owned. And I think quite quickly you could see changes happening. The other thing I think we have to do is to say that even on a world where things are really, truly bad, we will still have to fight for our resources. We will still have to fight to make sure that working people, that the poorest in society, that black communities and so on aren't ones to suffer the most. Why should we pay for a crisis that's been driven by the rich and the minority at top of society? So while there's still people fighting back, we must be always trying to fight to make sure things don't get worse, but also to make sure that the people at the bottom of society don't pay the price for the greed of the people at the top.
All right. And thank you for that there. Next question coming from Giannis. Let's see, what does anti-capitalist politics mean today? We're seeing an alarming global environmental crisis, and with COVID-19, some states have taken extraordinary measures in an attempt to try and save their economies and their vulnerable populations. Even in the best case scenarios, these measures fall short of what is truly needed to deal with COVID-19 today and future pandemic outbreaks. What are some of the anti-capitalist demands the left can champion today?
I think the first thing we would have to demand is that there is no further expansion of the oil, of the fossil fuel industries. The oil has to be left in the soil, the coal has to be left in the ground, the gas has to be left where it is in the shale beds and so on. There can be no more extraction. That, I think, is the very first demand. And the second demand that flows from that is that we want to see the breakup of those fossil fuel corporations that are doing the damage. We don't want to see bailouts for them. We want to see money funneled towards infrastructure projects and engineering projects that will make the world more sustainable. The expansion of public transport, a switch of energy generation on an enormous scale to a mixture of renewable sources and so on. And there's a whole myriad of examples like that I'm sure comrades can come up with. The second thing, I think, a part and parcel of that is we need to fight and demand a just transition. You see, it's quite hard for socialists because rightly we always stand with workers fighting back, and we always stand with workers who want to defend their jobs and so on. So when an airline is under threat or an airport is about to go bust, we're on the side of those workers who are fighting to defend their jobs, their livelihoods, and so on. But we also recognise that those industries are enormously destructive to the long-term future. So I think we have to develop a series of demands around the concept of just transition, that those men and women should be redeployed, retrained immediately into jobs that can improve that are better for the planet without any loss of pay or conditions and so on. And I think that has to be done quite clearly. Here in the UK, the campaign against climate change that I'm part of has developed a program called the 1 Million Climate Jobs Plan, which is a demonstration of how you could create 1 million new jobs very, very quickly in industries that directly reduce energy emissions from polluting industries. And I think those sort of plans are linked to the concept of Green New Deals and so on. I think the third thing we have to demand is at the heart of all of this, there has to be a question of social, racial justice and so on, that we want to use our response to the environment to iron out and to end as much as possible under capitalism, oppression and racism and bigotry. And that's important because climate change and environmental crisis impacts in unequal ways. As I said, with COVID-19, it impacts along fracture lines in society. So it impacts the poorest in society first and foremost. It impacts Black and Asian people, people of colour, more than it does white people. It impacts women more than it impacts men. And so we have to make sure that those inequalities are dealt with. The fourth thing I think the movement has to do is to fight for an expansion and a radicalisation of the environmental movement. We want to see bigger, more widespread protests. We want to see the next climate strike day, which is on September the 25th, if you're not in lockdown, as big as possible globally. We want to see trade union movement and the workers coming out alongside the school students who've been on protest and on strike. We want to see the Extinction Rebellion protests where they happen in the UK, supported by wider social movements, whether it's workers' movements, anti-racist movements, and so on. And the very final thing is that I think we want to bring all of these things together. We want to say that anti-racists and Black Lives Matter activists have got something in common with people fighting against environmental destruction. We want to say that there's something in common between trade unionists fighting for better working conditions as with those fighting for fighting against the impacts of climate change. And the very final thing, I suppose, is that we do have to say the solution has to be revolutionary. That's not to mean that we are going to have to wait for a global workers' revolution before we'll solve environmental crisis, but actually that the process of fighting for revolutionary change, the process of people fighting on an enormous scale, will start to win reforms that will challenge capitalism. And it's that sort of vision, I think, that taking on capitalism has to be at the heart of what we're trying to do. It's too late to tinker with the edges of the system. We have to smash the system and fight for it on a large scale to win any like the demands we need.
All right. And our next question comes from Fidel Costco. Question, could Martin please address or comment on whether he thinks degrowth, challenging the idea that economic growth is a useful way of measuring and organizing social health, would need to be part of any effective green policy or at the heart of the kinds of mass revolutionary movements he places hopes in? Is degrowth a useful political framework?
Well, I think, as I said, this links to the way Marxists look at how capitalism organized. Capitalism is a system of continual expansion, a system where growth is utterly central to how economies have to function. That without an ever expanding economic system, without the ever constant production of new commodities, the system will collapse and can't function. That system of accumulation that Marx wrote about and Marx highlighted as the fundamental problem of capitalism in terms of its relationship to nature. So I suppose for me is what would the definition of degrowth be? Because I want to see a society that isn't organised along the lines of ever ongoing accumulation of wealth for the sake of it, which means that actually we have to organise society differently. Now, if that means that, and I'm not suggesting the comrade is saying this, but if this means that we have to somehow shrink the economy, that we all have to have less, that we're all going to get less property, or we're all going to have less wages and so on, then I don't think that's a viable alternative, because it won't bring on board ordinary people to a vision of transforming society. If what I was suggesting, though, is that actually we want a new way of organising society, then that's a very different way of looking at things, because growth won't be a factor in that, and degrowth will be not about so much about shrinking our personal relationship with wealth, but it will be about transforming and changing how we measure wealth and how we see how society is organised. So I think the question is really the choice between revolution or trying to tinker with the system, because I think sometimes people who advocate degrowth strategies are suggesting that somehow we can make a sort of a capitalist society that has less impact, less damage to the world. Actually, I want to see an end to capitalism. I'd like to see a system where that sort of relationship isn't part and parcel of how we understand the world we live in. I think you're muted.
Silly me. Thanks for pointing that out. Next question comes from Claire in Los Angeles. What do you think is the role of technology and scientific innovation in solving climate crisis?
This is a live question, because I noticed today a report in the UK Financial Times, which is a newspaper of the business sort of community, the 1%, so to speak, and they were highlighting that there's been a number of responses from sort of West Coast entrepreneurs and Silicon Valley types to suggest that what we actually need is better technology, better firefighting strategies, better understanding of how fire impacts upon on the West Coast, and forest fires take place, better ways of fighting the forest and so on. And I think, of course, we do need technology. We need to improve the renewable infrastructure that we have. We need to improve the energy grids. We need to find new ways of doing things in more sustainable ways. But I think there's a tendency, and it's quite central to how the capitalists view the world, to simply say that what they need is is better technology to solve things, that we need a technological magic bullet that we can fire that will fix the environment for everyone. And I don't think that's possible, because as I tried to outline in my talk, the problem is a social and economic and political one. It's about how capitalism accumulates wealth, how it relates to nature, how capitalism understands and uses and commodifies the natural world in the interests of making profit. And that won't be solved by improving technology. The technology already exists, as a whole number of different studies have shown, to generate the world's energy requirements from renewable energies. The barrier to doing that is an economic and political one. It's people like Trump, it's people like Boris Johnson, who won't redirect the resources and the energy because they're too busy supporting their wealthy friends. So I think we can look for technological solutions and technological innovations, but we want to take them out of the hands of the capitalists. The capitalists are only interested in technological innovation when it makes them money, not when it saves the planet or improves people's lives. And really, another argument, if you like, for socialism is that we could open up innovation and technological development to really benefit the majority of people, not just the 1%. You're muted.
And once again, I'm muted. My apologies to everyone. Let's see. Chris in San Diego would first like to thank you for a great talk, and asks if you could talk a bit about the connection between climate crisis and the refugee crisis.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this is going to become a growing part and parcel of how we have to understand and relate to the environmental crisis. millions of people are already affected by climate change. There are some reports that suggest to 1 billion refugees by the year 2100, simply fleeing from environmental crisis. And when you see, as I did earlier, I think in Oregon and in the States there, 500,000 people under threat of a warning of having to move because of the fires at short notice, you get a sense of how quickly vast numbers of people can have to flee from climate disaster. You know, floods impact over a vast area very, very quickly. The destruction from hurricanes, typhoons, and so on. So, as the crisis gets worse, you're going to see more and more people fleeing them. And the term climate refugees is actually sometimes contested, partly because people don't necessarily flee climate change, they flee the impact of climate change, a flood or a failed harvest or war, as states go to conflict over access to natural resources. So the phrase itself is sometimes contested, but I think it is fair to say that as climate change gets worse, there will be more and more people on the move, and many of those people will flee to neighbouring countries, and some of them will try to come to the West. And the way things are set up now, they'll be met with barbed wire, they'll be met with armed machine guns, they'll be met with racist politicians blaming them and scapegoating them for all sorts of things. And we only have to look at the response in Europe to a few thousand migrants trying to cross the Mediterranean to see that there is already you already see examples of that. So the first thing I think to say is that part and parcel of response to the climate crisis has to be to say refugees are welcome, that the causes of climate change and the countries that have driven climate change predominantly have been Western economies, and they've grown wealthy and strong on the back of destroying and using the natural resources of the rest of the world, in particular the global South. And we've got a historic responsibility to help those people who are fleeing from our disasters, and that's an ongoing process. You know, most of the world's emissions and most of the cause of climate change are coming from countries like the United States, like Britain, like Europe, and so on. And the other thing I think is to advocate and fight very, very hard for resources to be released to help people in distress. Not everyone who's fleeing climate change, not everyone who's fleeing environmental disaster is going to arrive in the US or in Britain. And we should make sure that the obscenity of refugee camps with people hungry and starving and lacking basic healthcare is ended by massive amounts of aid as part of the reparations, if you like, for almost 2 centuries of environmental destruction by Western capitalist countries.
All right, we still have time for a couple more questions here. So if anybody still has any questions or any new questions have come up, feel free to put them in the Facebook or YouTube chat, and we may be able to get to another couple. But here we've got one from Rebecca in San Diego. Last year, we saw massive worldwide climate protests and strikes. This year, we saw massive protests for Black lives and racial justice, not to mention the uprisings against austerity in fall of 2019. Are we entering in a time of new struggle? How or can these struggles for climate and racial justice be united?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, I think if the pandemic hadn't happened, we would have seen a development of all the social movements that Rebecca mentioned there. And also, let's not forget that in the run-up to towards the end of 2019, there were some real global, real mass movements developing, particularly in the global South, places like Chile and Tunisia and so on, where large numbers of workers were coming into conflict and fighting neoliberalism, privatization, and so on. And many of those were shaped and infected by wider social struggles, the Me Too movement, anti-racist movements, and so on. And so I think that those protests and those movements would have developed further if there hadn't been the pandemic. I however think that those social movements haven't gone away, partly because the underlying conditions haven't gone away. The reality of unemployment, poverty, racism, sexism is there. And even in the time of lockdown, the amazing Black Lives Matter movement that explodes in America and then generalizes around here. I mean, where I am in Manchester, there was a Justice for George Floyd protest just yesterday, inspired by events in America, but also to coincide with the trial that's starting there. So those movements haven't gone away, and I certainly think that they will re-emerge. I think it's actually not that difficult to draw the links between the different struggles. Partly, as I said, because climate change, environmental disaster tends to impact disproportionately. So there's a direct link, for instance, between anti-racist movements, refugee solidarity, and environmental movements. I also think, though, we do have to draw links between other movements that are not necessarily automatic. I mean, one of the things we do in the campaign against climate change I mentioned earlier here in the UK is to talk to trade unions and workers' organisations, and to say, actually, you're part of the solution, and we can create jobs, we can create well-paid jobs, we can create union jobs in solving the environmental crises. And so I think we sometimes have to think a bit innovatively about how climate change impacts, but also then what the solutions might look like and how they can do. But as I say, I think the reality is climate change is a capitalist crisis. Racism is caused by capitalism, sexism, homophobia, unemployment, poverty, and so on. We can link the threads together to argue that the solution is a fight back against the system itself.
All right, and let me check here, and just checking to see if we have any further questions coming in. I am not right off seeing any, but I'm sure if folks have any other questions after you wrap up here, Martin, and they can. They can reach out. We'll be putting our contact information for Marx21 into the Facebook and YouTube comments. If folks come up with anything more or want to get in contact and discuss. But again, not seeing any further questions right at the moment. I'll go ahead and pass it back over to you there, Martin, for a wrap up. And go ahead and take it away.
Thanks again, and thanks to everyone for the questions. I suppose the last thing I really want to sum up on is that there is a relationship between the COVID-19 crisis and the environmental crisis, which we haven't talked about, which is the way that capitalism, through its destruction of the environment and through its distortion of ecological relations, drives the creation of pandemics, in particular because of the nature of industrial agricultural food production under capitalism. That the concentration of animals in very large numbers in small spaces, the deforestation that takes place in particularly the global south in the interests of agriculture, not just animal agriculture but all agriculture, helps, I think, to create the conditions for pandemics to start, like COVID-19 or avian flu or SARS and so on. And what's interesting, the reason I suppose I bring that up at the end, is that one of the things that Marx and Engels did in their writings back in the 19th century was to analyze these processes as they were taking part and as that place and as they were beginning under capitalism, and use them to develop an appreciation of capitalism as a system that destroys the environment and destroys ecological relations. And that tradition, I think, has been lost a bit and forgotten. That knowledge and that sense of Marx and Engels not just trying to analyze how capitalism works, but also to understand how humans and society and nature interrelate with each other. And there's a real rich tradition, both in terms of Marx and Engels' original writings, but also by revolutionaries and socialists and Marxists in the years that have come since. And I do encourage listeners and comrades to try and read some of that material, both Marx and Engels in the original and the work of Marxists like John Bellamy Foster, Ian Angus, Paul Burkitt, Rob Wallace, who's written expertly on capitalism and pandemics and so on, and many other authors, because I think understanding the world as it is and understanding the system and the destruction that it creates and the way it wastes people's lives and destroys entire environments is one of the is despairing, but it also means that we have a vision of how things can be different, and I think it's worth us exploring those ideas and developing those thoughts to better understand the world in order to change it. So thanks again, once again, to Marx21 for organising and inviting me to talk.
Well, all right, and thank you again as well, Martin. Yeah, taking time out of your busy schedule there. I do appreciate that. And thanks as well to everyone else tuning in and for raising your questions in this discussion. If you like what you've heard here today or are interested in learning more, please go ahead and check out the Marx21 website, Marx21US.org. And you can also fill out our Google form for contact information. Should be shared in the comments here. And all right, and then we can stay in contact. If you'd like to come to more of our meetings, we usually, when we're not having speakers from 5 to 8 hours ahead of us, usually have our meetings Sunday afternoons, 3 p.m. United States Pacific time, 6 p.m. Eastern. And we hope to see you all at one of those meetings.